All right, welcome everybody. I am so thrilled to have Dr. Emily Kieson here with us today. I've been wanting to connect with Emily for some time, and we have, and life just seems to take over. And I was just telling Emily before we hit record that time blindness is absolutely a thing. And so here we are today, and I'm very, very pleased that we were able to carve out some time to have a chat about all things equine, ethology, science, welfare, trauma, whatever, fun nerding out time. So Emily, maybe you could introduce yourself to the audience and just let people know who you are and what you do, and we'll jump off from there.
All right, sounds good. Thank you again for having me. It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to catch up. It's been a while, like you said, and I'm always excited to talk about these topics, and it's lovely to be able to share this conversation with other people too. So, who I am? My name is Emily Kieson. I'm executive director of Equine International. It's a U.S.-based nonprofit 501(c)(3). It's a research institute. About 50% of what we do is research. The other 50% is education and outreach. And we've recently actually been starting to collaborate with different organizations here in the area to work with them to develop equine-assisted work. So a lot of our research is based on equine behavior, equine behavioral psychology, especially in the context of equine-human interactions. But of course, since we don't know a lot about who horses are without people, we also have to do some research in terms of wild and free living horses to get a baseline and as our control variable in terms of looking at who horses are, what they do, their pro-social behaviors, both agonistic and affiliative, and then seeing how that carries over to the domestic world, and especially in equine assisted services. So that's what I do now. My trajectory and path in life has been up and down and wandering around, and finally found my way here, and it's amazing. But we do have the amazing place right now to be collaborating with universities and organizations all over the world for research and education and outreach and workshops, and basically helping to bridge the gap between research and what's going on in the domestic world. And it's this amazing, ever changing, ever growing, ever evolving space that I feel very grateful to be a part of.
Awesome, wonderful. Thanks, Emily. Lots of moving and shaking going on. Yeah, it's an exciting time. That's very cool. What are some of the most recent projects you've been involved with that you're excited about?
Well,
If you're able to share,
where do
if you're
we
able to
start? No,
share, yeah.
it's like this ongoing list. It's great. There's some that have been going on for a couple of years now. We're developing a very big, it ended up being a very big ethogram on affiliative behaviors, and it's based on the research and the videos and data that we've been collecting on free living and wild living horses in mostly in Europe, but also Mongolia and here in the States, so that there's a more comprehensive ethogram on affiliative behaviors regarding how horses demonstrate social bonding and friendship behaviors, and the nuances and small development of those over the course of their lifetime even. So it started out as this little ethogram, and then because it's exploratory. So we're watching. I have amazing research assistants that are helping me, and it's about watching and collecting these patterns, and it's just kind of grown into this thing, and it's really cool. But again, I have a group of amazing research assistants. They're continuing to do this and code the data, and we meet every other week to just touch base and confirm what's going on. So there's that, which has been sort of developing over time. We did get a couple of grants from the Anne Kern Goodall Foundation to develop an equine-human ethogram for equine-assisted services. So that's been in the works. We've been partnering with facilities here in the US, Canada, Finland, UK, different places in Europe to kind of go back and forth in developing this tool that will eventually be for free, and giving people kind of a structured way to look at interactions with the knowledge base of that research side of the ethograms that have been available for years regarding the horse behavioral side. I'm also working with AI and developing artificial intelligence programs to help people get better tools to assess their own horses' well-being and welfare through apps on the phone. So I'm working with a group in Switzerland and another one in Germany to develop different technologies to help with that too. So I was collecting data for that this morning. So we have, I think we've just been lucky that over the last, I mean, I've been collecting data for many years now. So we have thousands of hours of with thousands of horses, videos on pro-social behaviors, and especially in stable social systems where we can really get at what's going on within their social systems. How does this look at the individual level? How does this look at the social group level? And then taking those behaviors, looking at the context, looking at the measurable quantitative factors, and then linking it back to our domestic world to see how we can better assess our equine's welfare and well-being. What measures can we put in place to help support them, if depending on what's coming up. So we're working through some of that right now. But yeah, I have about 5 or 6 working research projects right now, in addition to like education and other things. Yeah, so that's sort of the short version of it.
I love that. Maybe we could explain for the audience what ethograms are. I know my students are well aware of what ethograms are, but I think the average individual may or may not be aware of that. So if you'd be willing to kind of give a short description of, in your words, how you would define what an ethogram is and what its value can be for the average horse owner or someone in the field of equine-assisted psychotherapy and learning, or someone who's an equine body worker, or someone who's a horse trainer or equine behavior consultant. You know, they have a really interesting function, and I'd be curious to hear how you would describe them from the standpoint of your work. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's just, first of all, there's different ways to look at ethograms. The ethograms, like what we're developing, are structured approaches to observing behavior. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're looking at a behavioral ethogram that is used to help us understand behavior, then we're looking at a definition of a behavior. Specifically, what does it look like? And usually what it's indicating in terms of, does this fall under a stress behavior? Does this fall under play behavior? Those types of things. And so a lot of the ethograms that are out there will provide you kind of an oversight. Sometimes there's a picture involved or a drawing that helps indicate what is seen during this. And there's usually a term that has a working definition to it. So it'll be mouth play, for example, with a horse with an object, the object play, and that kind of a thing. And then it'll have a very specific description, very objective, specific description of what's going on with the different body parts of the horse. And it usually is then oftentimes backed up by additional research that links certain behaviors to certain physiological indicators like cortisol and stress and different things. Sometimes that, or sometimes not. Sometimes it's about contextual, much like what we're doing in terms of, here we have horses that are sharing proximity with each other for long durations of time, which we know is linked to preferences of individuals for each other in a pro-social way in terms of friendship and social bonding. And we're looking at what goes on within that space, the different behaviors that happen there. And so we already have the foundational elements within science to say, okay, these horses are preferring each other, they're preferred conspecifics or friends. What other indicators do they have that showcase what's going on? And then when do they use those behaviors to communicate? So that's the type of ethogram that we're creating right now. How they're used in public. Well, people can create their own ethograms, for example, by going out and doing structured observations. Like you're looking for how many steps your horses take over a period of time, or who's doing what with whom at this time of day. You link it to a timestamp or a duration or a frequency. So there's a measurable quantity in there to look for patterns. So what we're doing is looking for patterns of behavior, and then again, linking it back into research, because what we want to do is, it's great to observe, but we want to give sort of a link between that observation and the usage of it. So again, that links back into, what do we know from the research? What do we know from our work or from previous work or from what's out there in terms of, oh, yes, you know what? Tail swishing and bucking and head tossing are all linked to stress behaviors based on the research here. And look, I see my horse doing that. So it's being able to link back structured observation, structured objective observations to research, and then putting into action, what is the meaning of this? What can I do to help support or facilitate things? Like if we're looking for indicators of friendship that give us indicators of welfare, whether it be between horses or hopefully between horses and people. Under
Mm.
what types of conditions does that occur? And how can we be more cognizant of understanding when that happens, under what conditions that happens, and really painting a bigger, more robust picture of what our horses' lives look like and how we fit into that.
So it's so funny and fun to hear you talk about this stuff because I just taught a module with some of my own students, and we talk literally within Somatic Experiencing being a model that was developed by Peter Levine, which is based on animal ethology. So it's kind of fun to take that and bring it back around. For those of you who don't know, SE was created by Peter Levine. He's certainly not the first person to come up with some of these ideas, and certainly isn't the last, and has borrowed, he himself is a giant sitting on the shoulders of many giants. You know, there's all these people who've influenced each other, you know, mutually over time and through his observations of ethological animals and through an ethological lens, you know, animals in the wild, and connecting with indigenous communities in South America and medical biophysics and all these different areas have coalesced to create it. And so I kind of come at this from this other side where it's essentially the same thing. And we're talking about how do we set different conditions? How do we track behavior, affect, you know, sometimes sensation, nervous system, state shifts in human and in equine beings, so to speak, individually or with each other, and what conditions are creating what we're seeing. And there's so often, I'm reminded of like, was it Francesco Di Giorgio's work, who talks a lot about this idea of like, we create a flight animal by training what we think is a flight animal. I forget his quote. I'm going to butcher it here. I'll make sure I add it in the edit at the bottom. I'll put the actual quote. I always get it wrong, but it's the essence of it for me is what we're seeing an artifact of the conditions, right?
Mhm.
And so we've got this myth of horse as flight animal, but myth of horse as XYZ, or a myth of horse as this highly conflictual, unsafe animal. Not that horses cannot be unsafe. At times they're large and, you know, and it's like, oh, and how much of that is reflective of captivity conditions, you know, relational conditions with owners, you know, how much of that is reflective of what they're experiencing environmentally and in relationship. And then we
Yeah.
start to not see it as being something to be flagging. We just see it as normal. And in reality, it could very well just be an artifact of the conditions and what changes when we shift the conditions. And so
Hmm.
there's more to it than that, of course, but this idea of not just tracking behavior, but also like I think about this idea of like the meta awareness of watching it in a sequence, like, oh, what happened just before that? And what happens if we follow it next? Because it's not
Absolutely.
so static, right? It's this thing that is occurring in real time in a dynamic way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because
Mm,
there's a relational side to it. I mean, you have to recognize it's a relationship not just of two individuals, but individual with the environment. And there's a
yeah.
past, present, and future with that. And within that, the learning that takes place and the adaptations that take place as a result of the learning. So that
Yeah.
context and the recognition that horses have memories, horses sequence events, horses can predict what's coming based on past experiences, and that realization of how things are going to take place in their world based on previous experiences, especially with us, and what
Yeah.
have we created within that that
Yeah.
is leading to what we have now. So
Yeah.
yeah, that whole part where we walk into this horse world and we're immediately told, here's a flight animal who is going to kick you if you walk behind it, and
Yeah.
it's all about safety, and safety is therefore all about control, because the only way we can predict our horse's behavior is if we control it, and that's how we get safety. And it's kind of this backwards way of looking at it, because if we look at horses again in these free living environments without human interference or interactions, they're social, they're curious, they're they're all about exploratory behaviors. Um, just like any other animal, if something happens and they get startled, of course they'll move. Like we do too. This isn't
Yeah.
just a horse thing. Like this is just
Yeah.
how this happens. Um,
Yeah.
they're communicative, but all of this stuff of, oh my gosh, they're flighty animals. Yeah, looking at that's like, all right, well, that's not what we see when we take out the human and domestic equation. So what's going on? Like
Yeah.
what's going on over here?
Yeah.
And that recognition of, again, that we're put into this environment where we automatically have this idea of horses being X,
Hmm.
and therefore we take the initiative to interact with them based on that assumption,
Yeah.
and then we actually cause that assumption. So
Self-fulfilling prophecy
yeah,
for sure.
exactly.
Confirmation bias. Yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah. exactly.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of this thing about safety. In our training program, we talk a little bit about the safety rules versus neuroception of safety. And like you can have all the safety rules in the world, and they probably came about as a result of unsafe situations, right? Fair enough. And
Mhm.
you can have all the safety rules in place in the world, but if you're not attending to your own nervous system state, or you're acting in a way that's eliciting or creating a fear response in the animal, like through your own agitation or missing their cues, and we're not tracking sort of in an accurate sort of way, you can have all the safety tools and rules in the world, but if the animal doesn't feel safe with you, or if you don't actually feel safe with that animal, say you've come off of a horse, you've had a head injury, now you go to the barn, you've got to save face, you got to get back on that animal, you got to make sure that you look a particular way, oh, I've got this thing licked, I've got this under control, and you've got a lot of charge, and you're trying to mask that charge, and the animal is feeling that charge. Doesn't matter how many safety rules got in place, there's going to be an escalation potentially of nervous system state reflective of I feel unsafe. And if I'm not safe, and if I feel like I'm activated in some way, I'm going to be less attentive to cues, or I'm only going to notice the cues that indicate danger, right? Because I myself am looking for danger. And so then we've got this situation that escalates. And then it's like, oh, see, this is why we have all these safety rules. And it sort
Yeah.
of becomes this cycle. And
Yeah.
part of it for me is, okay, well, it's not that safety rules are wrong or bad, but let's look a little bit beyond just this prescriptive thing. Yes, have those. Those are helpful. And, what happens if we actually get relational? What happens if we actually track ethogram style, like
Mhm.
we watch, and for ourselves and for the animal, how can we track behavior, sensation, affect, like gesture, expression? There's all these things we can start to pay closer attention to.
Yeah.
And it would be very different, I think, if we start
Yeah,
to more.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, it's really that, we we get into this idea of, okay, here's a, again, slight dangerous animal. We're going
Yeah.
to put lots of different equipment on it to control its behavior, because then if we control its behavior becomes predictable, and that is therefore safe. And so we have
Yeah.
all of these mechanisms in place to control.
Yeah.
But the problem is that oftentimes just it heightens the stress level, and you actually
Yeah.
get, and there's less communication coming from the horse as a result. Whether the horse has become shut down, or it's unable to express behaviors and communication because it's so restricted in terms of its movement, that you
Yeah.
actually have less idea of what's actually going on for the horse, which actually makes it less safe, as
Yeah.
you said. But what
Yeah.
we really want is for everyone, like, that safety comes from, like you said, that
Mhm.
it starts with the feeling of safe. Once you have it, if an animal, human, horse, otherwise, feels safe, they're more likely to be able to express and communicate, because they're in that position to do that. They're in a position
Yeah.
to communicate their needs, communicate their desires, connect with whoever they need to connect with in terms of, that need for interaction during stressful moments, asking for help.
Yeah.
If they are allowed to do that, then we have more information, because they're able to express all those behaviors. And if we have all more information, then we can act on more information. And therefore, that's what makes us safe, because we can then act on, and we have more information based on their expressive behaviors. And then we can create a more dynamic system where safety is there, but it's not about what we can and can't do. It's about
Yeah.
creating a space of communication, so we understand what's going on for all individuals and are able to act on that information. So that's where that, like, where we come from in terms of, all right, yeah, it's great to know behaviors, but you have to allow your horse to have those behaviors and be able to express
Yeah.
those behaviors, and
Yeah.
allowing them the choice to do that. So, if the animal is so constricted they can't do that, then typically their stress levels are going to continue to go up, which means that when they have that choice to, or have that opportunity to make a choice and communicate, it's likely going to be bigger. But
Mhm.
generally speaking, giving them the opportunity to provide us with multiple different levels of communication gives us more information, which then allows us to have more safety, because we have more information to act upon. So it's that, it's like Maslow's hierarchy. If you don't have that feeling of safety, if you don't have that, physical feeling of physical and emotional psychological safety, you're not going to get to these other parts where you can have all these other types of interactions. But if we've taken that away, then that's what's going to make it difficult, and that's what's going to make it unsafe.
Well, and this focus on rules, I think about like contraction and expansion patterning, right? It's like, oh, I feel unsafe, and then I grip and I tighten more, right? And I try to tighten the control because of fear. And it's not that a reliance on rules, again, like rules have their place. But it's a yes and, right? There's more to the picture than just strictly this legalistic rule-based sort of thing. And like you're saying, I think the more we contract, the more unsafe we end up becoming. And then we've got this self-fulfilling prophecy stuff. And we see this sort of fed into with insurance companies as well. And like there's all these like legalistic sort of environments. I think because horses, unfortunately, have been given this reputation of unsafe, how many people have had falls, how many people have had head injuries, and insurance companies look in on that and say, well, in order to maintain safety, you have to have this horse, under control. And it's like, okay, and there's more to it than that, right? It's not so simple as that. And yet we live in this world where are all these structures. And one of the things I think about is I so often think about how our way of being with animals often reflects how we were parented, and the messages we received in our own childhoods and around, okay, like it's not okay to have needs, right? We have to shove that stuff down, right? And we have to, children should be seen and not heard and stuff that away and stop paying attention to your needs, right? How many of us have had that kind of messaging where it wasn't okay to express your voice or have a need and it quietly goes unmet. And then so we don't see it on the outside because it's hard for us to even notice it perhaps on the inside kind of idea. And then it's like, oh, and so what's the impulse? Is like, oh, the impulse is for me to tighten more. Oh, if there's fear, the impulse is to tighten. Well, that makes sense. And that's the response. That's not necessarily, the bigger picture, and I go, I wonder what would happen if we start to attune differently or listen in differently. And it's hard to listen in or attune if we haven't been attuned to. Like we can't even see our own sequence, let alone that of the animal. So it becomes this interesting conversation around how do we like start to shift out of, because I've heard of so many situations where there's like, I think this is more so perhaps in therapeutic riding than equine-assisted psychotherapy and learning, but like needing to make sure the horse is always on a rope, always on a lead rope, never, always has to be under control, always at all times. And yet these horses are now confined and they're doing this and they feel like they can't move or create space to move away from, say, a stimulus that's becoming problematic for them. And maybe they're starting to get a little stimulus stacked a little bit along the way. And we're just expecting them to tolerate. And then kablooey. And then it's like, see, this is why we have them on a rope. And it's like, we could have actually intervened that a lot sooner by loosening a little bit. And then we might not have gotten to that point by catching it sooner and loosening a bit sooner. Makes sense? Yeah. And I feel like this
Well,
happens a lot. Yeah.
yeah, because I work a lot with therapeutic writing too.
Mm,
It's the other side of it. In fact, for me,
yeah.
it is the most difficult place to work for what I do,
Mm,
because it's so much about the horses performing a use for
yeah.
people,
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
more so than even performance horses and show horses. This is
Yeah.
because the individual on their back may or may not, be really interacting with the horse as much. And it's literally
Mhm.
just about, here's an individual sitting on a moving object, for lack of a better term, that happens to be a horse.
Mhm.
And that horse is expected to perform a certain amount of way, regardless of what the person on the back is doing, or
Mhm.
anybody else for that matter. And I know I'm being super critical right now, and I don't mean to be. I'm not trying to undermine the the industry, but we have to pick it apart. And for me, that's about, okay, could this animal be replaced by a machine? There
Mhm.
are amazing mechanical horses out there that produce the bilateral rhythmic stimulation of horseback riding.
Sure.
So if we're making the conscious choice to incorporate a horse into this, what do we need to know? What do we need to do better? What do we need to be in? So I come from a very critical perspective, even though I know that therapeutic riding does great things for people, but I've also been in that field for long enough to know that the horses in that field often have more expressions of and negative anticipation,
Mhm.
conflict or stress behaviors, confusion behaviors. And oftentimes one of the biggest reasons why horses burn out in that field is due to, quote, behavioral problems. So, all right, what are we doing? What can we do better?
Right.
And I don't want to undermine the industry and say, don't do it, because it's going to keep
Yeah.
going. I want to figure out a way to do it better. And so I step
Yeah.
into that world to see what we can do. And a lot of it is um, there are a few studies, one of yet has not been published, but I managed to read it recently, talking about the importance of the horse handler, the horse leader in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, and I've been in all of these roles. I used to be a therapeutic riding instructor. I've been a horse leader, horse handler. I've been a sidewalker, and those are the people who are usually, under many circumstances, more interacting with the horse. So what can we do in those roles to
Mm-hmm.
be better for the horse, so that the
Mm-hmm.
horse feels more supported in this space? But also ask ourselves, does this horse want to be here to begin with?
Yeah.
And making better choices on that side too. But within that space, again, getting back to that part where, what is the horse telling us when they're behaving? Like, does
Yeah.
the horse feel comfortable enough to communicate and provide behaviors? What is the horse communicating? Why is the horse communicating this? And being really objective about that. Not, oh, he's misbehaving, or,
Yeah.
oh, she's being ornery. Um, and and addressing the needs of the horse. Here is the main vehicle for this particular activity:
Mm.
being supportive, being, learning what it means to be a good partner for the horse in that space. And
Mm-hmm.
that's typically not taught. And it's usually, just like you said, it's usually just about, how do you lead? How do you, correct unwanted behavior? And I mean, I could go on and on about the stories that I've had
Yeah.
with regards to my own personal experiences, but, you know, rather than, correcting or trying to control a behavior,
Mm.
allowing that communication and that nuanced development of the relationship between the horse and the people, including the individual on its back, being a part of the lessons.
Yeah.
Talking about how this horse is communicating this. Maybe we can adjust for the horse's needs too. Maybe we can do
Yeah.
this. Maybe we can talk about the relationships that are going on with the horse, to include that as part of the active lesson.
Yeah.
Um, and that's typically not talked about as much. And I wish it, and I hope that someday it is more. And so I'm working with some people to just shift literally one program into, like, one therapeutic riding program that I work with,
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
this space of um, talking with the parents, because these are usually younger kids, but
Mm-hmm.
even so, even if it is adults, about, we're bringing this animal into this space. Let's talk about the animal too. Let's talk about
Yeah.
this interaction that's going on with us and the animal, because it's there. I don't care how much you want it or don't want it. That relational
Yeah.
component is there, and we need to look at that. We need to honor it. We need to understand it better.
Yeah.
And we can consciously also put that into the equation of, oh, look, it looks like he doesn't want to go over here. Well, what do you think we should do?
Yeah.
And, in terms of, like, if somebody says, oh, we should make him do it. Well, would you want to do something? Like, would you want somebody to make you do something you didn't want to do? Is it absolutely necessary we go over there? It looks like he wants to go over here. Is that okay too? Like, having those types
Yeah.
of communication, so we can talk about, so we can subtly bring in, listening, empathy, compassion, all of these other nuanced things, even if they aren't the goals of the actual session.
Mm-hmm.
If we're bringing other animals into this spaces, for me, that should come with that territory, um,
Yeah,
of
because I was
being
going to say
compassionate.
the goals for the human don't have to be contrary to the welfare of the animal getting to have a voice in
Exactly.
that experience. I'm reminded the same conversation is one that I have with regards to animal assisted activities, where, say, an animal like a horse or a dog or whatever is brought to a hospital or a nursing home, or that kind of idea, or even in equine assisted psychotherapy and learning, where we see, like, there's a video in mind there's so many videos that I can picture in my mind's eye. They get shared on social media, and my students have heard me say this a lot, where I finally, like, I find myself sometimes having these facetious sort of conversations around like humorously, but also semi seriously talking about like what is going on in this video, you know, and what I see is like a video of an animal in some sort of role to help a human of some kind. And the animal is showing a lot of stress behavior. You can see facial expression change, tightness in the jaw, peak over the eye, ears kind of starting to turn a little bit. Maybe they're doing even like attempts at shifting their gaze away, or they're shifting their weight away from the individual. And these sort of like covert but not so covert behaviors on the part of the handler to like, let's just push them back towards the human so the human can keep getting their warm fuzzy moment with this animal, because the human is struggling, marginalized, not receiving care or support. And so the human's needs supersede that of the animals in this moment, because I have this expectation to bring this animal, and it's somehow going to bring joy to the downhearted, so to speak, right? And there's this thing that happens where these videos or these photos, but often videos get shared on social media of circumstances like this, like dog being brought to hospital, to nursing home, to what have you, or horse or what have you. And invariably the comments are often, and this is where I get a little facetious and a little dramatic, but for effect, really, I'm not trying to be judgmental, but it's like, oh, horses are magic, and oh, you know, it's so amazing. And I kind of like sort of do this sort of comical bit with my students, but it's interesting for me because there's this immediate superficial perspective that the animal is going to be some sort of surrogate need meter, and that there is going to be, I'm reminded a lot of attachment theory and the call and response in our families of origin. I call and then there's a response, and it's not always going to be perfectly attuned, but through trial and error and continuity and consistency, we figure out what the thing is, and we get good enough at our caregiving, so to speak. And when that doesn't happen, and when I call and there isn't an attuned enough response that feels good enough, then I go through life without needs getting met. And I can, have these good intentions of creating situations where I see other situations where other people like myself didn't get my needs met. And I'm going to do this wonderful thing because I'm altruistic and I have good intentions. And it's done from such a wonderful place, it really, truly is. And then but there's this lack of seeing animal now as the next disenfranchised individual in that equation. And so the human may have been the original one who didn't get their needs met, and by some human who wasn't able to be attuned enough or supportive enough or what have you. And now it's like the animal gets to be this surrogate need meter replacement for the caregivers who failed, or a system that failed. And I'm going to come in with this animal and we're going to have these feel good moments, and the animal showing all these stress behaviors. And it's like all the commentary is, oh, wow, horses are magic and how amazing, and horses are healers. And it's just, there's such a disconnect for me in this. And I go, not from a judgmental place, but kind of like I wonder what those folks stopped learning how to see in themselves, you know? At what point did they stop seeing something within themselves so that they can't see it when it's right there too, right? And what they're seeing is like this lens of the need getting met, but they're not seeing the piece around the exploitation. And sometimes that's people's experiences too. They serve to meet the need of a caregiver in some way. And so, but all this stuff is just not in the awareness. And so there's this ethogram teaching of learning how to track behaviors. And sometimes that's the entry point. And sometimes the entry point is, how do we help people to start to recognize their own inner stuff and what they're no longer connected to on the inside, which affects what they see on the outside, because
Yes.
that's the other part of that equation. It's like there's the learning and the teaching and the instruction of it, but there's also like the personal healing bit, in all of that too, which I find is interesting and feeds into, unfortunately, situations where, like I think in therapeutic riding or animal assisted activities or even EAPL, where there's some sort of something and we're just not seeing. And when we try to think about it, it's like people don't go there. I was sharing with my students, I wrote a book chapter about this about a year ago for Laurie Kogan and I talked about inspiration porn. and this concept that came out, I think by the author's name was Young in like 2012 or 2013. This idea of looking at someone who's disabled and all the difficulty they go through and going, wow, my life must, my life is nowhere near as bad as that. And I get to take inspiration from that, but stay complicit in the conditions that result in them being the inspiration. And it's the same with the animals. It's like, oh, it's like almost like this animal assisted inspiration porn for me, where I go, okay, wow, the animals are magic, but yet I'm going to be complicit in the things that are making them uncomfortable while I get to stay inspired by what they're doing. But I'm going to turn a blind eye to the fact that I may be contributing to their discomfort in the first place, but so they can continue to be an inspiration for me. And it's just this interesting, like I make these posts about this and no one shares them. Like the posts that get shared are the ones about, wow, isn't this amazing? Horses are
Yeah.
magic. Or those are the ones that get shared millions of times. Sarah writes a little comment going, I think this is inspiration porn. I don't see an animal that's actually having a good time here. And like it's crickets,
But it's,
it
yeah,
is, yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
There's this idea, because horses fill this very unique space in our world, in our
Yeah.
culture, in our lives.
Oh,
Like
yes.
they don't,
Yeah.
they're technically, legally, at least in the US, livestock, but we
Yeah.
treat them like companion animals, and they fall through this crack in research because they don't get as much funding for research.
Yeah.
But in movies and in stories, there are these creatures who take us places, and unicorns
Yeah.
that meet us in the woods and come out of the ocean and run across the beach and whatever. So they have this like Disney fairy tale like thing
Mm.
or aura about them, and people feel good when they're around these big creatures. That it's funny because we just talked about that, like, oh, they're flight animals, oh my god, they're super scary flight animals, but then people put them on this magical unicorn space where
Yeah.
I feel so good when I'm around them. I feel so peaceful and they're so peaceful, and it's contradictory space. It's really interesting. And then
Hmm.
um and they want to, I'm making too many generalizations and I apologize for
Yeah,
that, but
yeah.
there's
We're
this
we're
there's
we're
this
making generalizations here,
yeah.
clearly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um
We recognize there's
yeah.
nuance. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
But there's this idea of, oh, these are magical mirror horses who only live in the moment, who are automatically attuned to us, who can telepathically read our emotions, and
Yeah.
all of these things, which what that, to me, what that does is that if people come from that belief, then they can validate anything that they do in this field.
Hmm.
And that, because they'll forgive us, and they'll get over it, they naturally love us, they naturally attune, they naturally do all of this, which means that we can do anything and feel validated for doing that, because these are mythical, magical unicorn creatures who, fit this idea that we have of them. When in reality, they're a very specific species. Yes, they share some space with us within our domestic history and our domestic environment, but they are an ecological species who fills part of an ecosystem. They did not evolve for us. They did not evolve
Yeah.
to serve us. And they have a very unique set of needs and of social skills and of all of these things that are often very much disrupted in our domestic world. Um,
Mm.
but if we don't give them credit for being the unique species that they are, just as much as sheep are unique species, and dogs and cows and squirrels, like they are,
Yeah.
to me, no more magical or special in terms of their biological amazingness as a unique species.
Yeah.
They just happen to share a different place in our culture and our history, and then we can learn more about them and learn more about who we are, as you just mentioned, through all of this. But if we don't recognize them as a species, we're not going to sit back, as you said, and take a look at who we are. Because if we're just objectifying them as magical unicorns, then
Mm.
there's no self-reflection in terms of how we interact with them, because
Yeah.
it won't matter, because they're a unique magical unicorn.
Yeah.
But if they're a horse with their own individual needs, histories, memories, associations, social spaces, then we have to take responsibility for how we interact. And we have to take responsibility for our role in this relationship. And that's a hard place for people to, I'm laughing because I have this
Yeah.
conversation with people and people don't want to go there. Um,
No, no, it's the hard thing about shame around unmet needs. And I think it often comes down to that, is that for me to look at how I rely perhaps or project my needs or expect another being to meet those needs can often speak to what I didn't get when I was smaller, perhaps. And to look at that and then to realize, woof, I'm actually maybe exploiting my animal in the way I was exploited. I'm using that word rather loosely here. I don't mean it in the heavy necessarily way of it, but I'm trying to find a better word and I just don't have one. I'm leaning into this animal in a way others leaned into me that maybe was a role reversal, right? Like it was so one directional and I was little and I couldn't possibly have, like how could that have been my situation? And it was up to the grown-ups to do something different and to recognize oneself as being complicit in a similar pattern to maybe what one experienced as a kiddo is a real hard place to go because it can bring up our shame and our guilt and our own sense of, oh, that means my needs are wrong or bad. No, your needs are absolutely necessary and valid and deserve to be looked at and grieved if they weren't met. But projecting them outwards in some sort of discerning kind of way, that doesn't have that awareness, that is more problematic. The needs themselves are not wrong. You've got needs, those are important, those are probably missed, and let's go there, and that's a big deal to grieve that stuff and to go into feel the anger of what wasn't there, and sometimes we shove all that anger and that grief away, and it comes out in this nice sort of projection uniform fantasy bond stuff, and it's like, oh, there's this. I was describing it in my head the other day as like this anthropocentric narcissism where and where does narcissism come from? We all have got to some degree a narcissistic wound where our needs were not met, right? And so where does that come from culturally, whether it's narcissism in the layperson's standpoint definition of the term, or like all the way to the other extreme of, say, narcissistic personality disorder, which is like this big conversation. But like if we take that big umbrella of the word and go, narcissism has to do with like myself and my needs and the woundedness that came from just existing in the world in some broader sort of way. And it's like, oh, yeah, that usually some sort of narcissistic wound reflects some place where I wasn't seen. My
Yeah,
needs weren't met, weren't acknowledged. And so I go around in the world in this sort of blind way because I wasn't seen. So how can I possibly see? And then here it comes. And so it's so hard to have the light shed on it without feeling shame because that's often the core emotion that was there was your needs are wrong or bad. And then we're back into the reenactment of, oh, it's so hard to go there because I'm now connected to the very thing I didn't want to have to feel, which is what I've been feeling all along. It's like, actually, no, I wonder, it's actually different. It's actually not that. How do we get people curious about moving in the direction of is because black and white thinking for me is like a classic trauma response. It's either all or nothing, polarized. And it's like, oh, if that's where it goes, it's like, oh, shoot, I'm starting to see it. And now I'm going to double down on my position or pretend like I never went there at all, or I'm going to flip back and forth. And it's like, but there's a whole range in between. It's not so all or nothing, good or bad. It's like, hey, you have needs and they've got needs. And I wonder how we can support both. It's not, oh, your needs get to be met and mine don't. I think of like transactional analysis has this idea of like win-win, win-lose, lose-lose kind of idea. And it's like, hey, this could actually be a win-win. It doesn't have to be a win-lose or a lose-lose. This could be a win-win. And
exactly.
it could look so different, if we hold a bigger
Yeah,
frame on it. Yeah. Hmm.
absolutely. And the trick is that the at least in my opinion, um,
Yeah.
most of the interactions that we've been taught to have in the horse world, like with
Yeah.
horses, they
Yeah.
come from tool use. They come from us
Yes.
using horses. And
Yep.
that's what we have. That's all we
Yeah.
have half the
Yeah.
time. Like
Yeah.
that's it. And so how do we, it's that part of evolving that space into something different, giving us a whole other tool set because we don't have the
Mm.
right tools to do what you were just talking about. That win-win part, that
Yeah.
the whole, like we can get into transactional analysis and economic theory around
Oh, yeah.
relationships and how that can happen between horses and humans, most of which is to benefit people. So it's this, like, if you look at
Hmm.
it in that sense, it's very much of a winning at the expense of another. And so
Yes. Yeah.
and we're using specific tool sets, again, mostly negative reinforcement for the most part, again, traditionally speaking,
Yeah.
um, that are focused on slight aversive interaction, sometimes severe aversive interaction, but usually negative reinforcement and positive punishment, where there's aversive, we are deliberately causing aversive interactions with another
Hmm.
animal in order to get something out of them.
Hmm.
All right, let's give ourselves a new tool set. that that
Yeah.
actually aligns with our goals.
Yeah.
Because people want these, they want the magical unicorn. They have this aversive tool set,
Yeah.
and yet, and they think that they have to, like, it's all about control and safety and fear. So, okay, let's put this back together differently this time.
Yeah.
We have the space to do that. We don't, well, at least in the Western world, we don't rely on our horses for agriculture or transportation anymore. So we have the flexibility to do it. We have the flexibility to approach this differently. Um,
Mhm.
we can ask the big questions. Do we even need to ride anymore? Do we even need to have horses as, like,
Mhm.
as tools for pleasure, performance, therapeutic riding, whatever? We can ask those bigger questions. But for me, the most important question is, okay, they're in our lives. What can we do better that aligns with our goal? And most of us want to have goals that are aligned with a more relational approach.
Yeah.
So what are those tool sets? And that's it. Then, to me, that's sort of, we have to kind of get back here and then kind of just, yeah, like approach it from that different
Yeah.
space. Um,
Yeah.
because a lot of the tool sets, now granted, we all still have to use halters, most of the time or some of the time. If you're lucky enough, you have space and flexibility where you don't need to, but that's
Mm.
rare. So, okay, some of these things are staying because our domestic environment is built in a way that relies on some of these things. Okay,
Yeah.
fine. But what other ways can we approach our interactions with our horses?
Mhm.
Um, what are our expectations of our horses?
Mhm. Mhm.
You just mentioned all these things, like, okay, what am I bringing into this equation? And therefore, what
Yeah.
are my expectations, whether it's conscious or unconscious, or subconscious, to look at
Mhm.
my relationship with my horse. What am I actually expecting of my horse? I
Yeah.
want him to come and bond with me and hug me every time I go into that pasture. If I'm feeling down and I'm feeling really upset, I
Yeah.
expect that my horse is going to come and comfort me. Are those real? Like, where is that coming from? I'm not a
Yeah.
therapist. I
Yeah.
work with therapists, but I'm not one.
Yeah.
But it's it's switching that dialogue a little bit in terms
Yeah.
of, if we're bringing in this, they're not a magical unicorn. This is
Yeah.
another creature with their own needs, desires, days, ideas of what they want out of this too, or don't
Mhm.
want.
Mhm.
And how do we bring that equation and that dialogue into fruition? And again, what are the tools that we need to move forward in that space? And
Yeah.
for me, that's where I'm coming from in terms of trying to dig out the nuances of the little behaviors of communication, of interactions, and especially of, when is it and under what conditions, or if it ever occurs at all,
Mm.
does our horse express some of these pro-social bonding behaviors with us?
Yeah.
Um, and how can that give us more insight into nurturing a better relationship? And for the therapists and professionals I do work with in the EAS field, it's, all right, that gives us more information, or
Mhm.
creating a better space in which to have options for assessing this, as opposed to, like you said, about, like, infinite YouTube videos around EAS where, like, someone's trying to get the horse to do X or
Yeah.
whatever, whether it's on a lead rope, liberty, whatever. There's, like,
Sure.
a lot of the tools that are they're being used are still coming from the equitation side. But
Mhm.
and obviously there are some really good um, professionals and practitioners out there who have this more relational space. Um, but again, what additional knowledge do we need? What additional ideas do we need to look at that from both human and horse perspective, so that we have a much broader idea of what that relationship is? And then we can, of course, talk about that in our domestic world with our humans and their own personal horses, to assess their relationship, but also the well-being of the horse. Like, how does your horse really feel about, you know, going on the trail or going to a show or
Mm.
being with this other horse in the paddock? Um, what are those indicators, so that we can support our horses in the lives they have and really get a better idea of how we fit into their lives, rather than how we want to fit into their lives.
Yeah. I'm reminded of this comes back around to this idea of ethology and ethograms and how that can inform like an EAS kind of program or even the average horse owner. And one example I often think about is horses that are exhibiting behavior that they've learned to associate with certain contexts, and they offer that behavior because they've learned maybe they're a very agreeable temperament wise horse, who's learned how to be agreeable as a way of, managing stress. I think of a bit appeasement research on horses with the hair cortisol in the mane, right? A very agreeable horse isn't necessarily one that's calm, right? Not all sociality is, pro-social behavior. Sometimes it's appeasement. And how do we recognize the difference? And it can be tough. We need to look at whole sequences of behavior and patterns of behavior over time to be able to say, is this like a comfortably pro-social affiliative behavior, ventral vagal, whatever language you want to call it, like a horse that is feeling safe relationally, or is this a horse that is exhibiting appeasement response type behavior? And the agreeableness is not a sign of safety, but a sign of this is how I'm learning how to manage my world because this is uncomfortable. And I'm reminded of ethology around like horses in the wild. And you did this really cool study a while ago of people under different conditions being told, okay, you're going to stand over here with this horse and you're going to pet them a particular way and you're going to stand over here. And I tell all my students about this one study that you've got. And I love it because I'm reminded of this idea that so many EAS programs are so touch heavy for the human. And we're primates, but also a lot of primates, as in human primates, are touch starved. And we live in a world where there's a lot of that difficulty. And there was a lot of needs, again, getting met through the animal. And often in EAS, the horse ends up being, or the donkey or the mule or the hinny or what have you, ends up being this sort of glorified petting zoo moment where it's like, okay, how do we, it's like all about the touching. And the touching isn't a relational process that involves mutually agreed upon renegotiated touch amongst the two of us. And I'm reminded of ethology and about horses in the wild, or feral bands that are sort of on their own. The horses that are the ones that will be in close proximity are ones that are friends. They've chosen their bands, they're in their family groups, and they're in proximity and they'll have touching because they're with their peeps, they're with their friends. They don't just go touch willy-nilly. And yet, so I think, well, if we're going to do some sort of EAS program, how are we from a distance even starting to build the relationship and the connection, even well into the approach, like well before we're in physical contact, you know, parameters here. How can we from a distance start to build a relationship so I can feel connection here, versus just here? And it speaks a little bit to the lack of object constancy. I need you right on top of me. So I know that you're there and I know that you exist. And it's like, hey, I wonder what it's like for both human and for equine, because some equines come in with a lot of attachment related traumas, so to speak, right? They're weaned too young, they're interfered with at birth, and there's all these things that happen. And it's like, oh, like I wonder how we can start to develop this for them, but within the context of EAS, how do we start to promote these services so that it's not just another petting zoo moment? Not that I'm agreeing with petting zoos necessarily, but you kind of get the idea. It's like, I'm going to come and the expectation off the get-go is I'm going to come and get to touch.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And how do we back it up and go, I wonder what happens even before, because there's all this stuff that happens in the lead up to contact. And we see it. There's videos on YouTube, and there's one in my head I think about a lot that I don't share with students because I don't have a way to block out faces and things like that, but it is publicly available. It is out there of, a video and someone's coming to do some EAL type work, and, the horse is showing little signs of flinching or looking away or turning its ears and moving its weight, and the contact is still happening. And then the horse tries to move ahead, and then one of the facilitators stands around and walks in front and blocks its exit. And it's like these little quiet, covert ways that as facilitators, we prevent the voice and the no so that it's this one-sided thing. And ethologically, animals in the wild, like horses in the wild, they don't touch unless they're friends. Like, how do we build the relationship first so that maybe touch doesn't become this hot commodity? It becomes this thing that's developed as a result of trust. It would mean more, I think, but it means changing
Absolutely.
the culture. It means changing the culture and the expectation up front. How do we prime the pump differently, so to speak? Yeah.
That's one of the magic questions. We don't exactly, how do we change expectations? How do we have this conversation with people in general saying that? And I think
Yeah.
that this is part of a bigger dialogue
Yeah.
of the industry in terms of changing the public's expectation of some of these programs. Again, whether it be therapeutic riding, EAS, pony parties, like whatever it is, like
Yeah.
recognizing, and that's a whole, again, that's an industry.
Yeah.
So it gets into this, like, all right, are the animals here to fill our needs, or can we approach this whole thing differently?
Mhm.
And that whole space of touch between horses, especially out in natural environments, it's consented. Like, it's
Yeah.
asked, it's consented. um
Yeah.
it's mutual when it's allo grooming, but all of the other little touches that take place are consented. And there's absolutely times when one horse will, usually under or after a stressful condition, exhibit more frequent affiliative behaviors, in oftentimes longer duration, but sometimes shorter. But it's a much more frequent, and it's like asking. It's like finding
Right.
that person. You're stressed at a party, you're finding your best friend, or just a friend, somebody
Yeah.
and you go over and you just touch their arm because you need to, you know,
Yeah.
ground yourself with them. That's sort of what we do. Okay, you might not do that often, but you're going to do that more frequently when you're stressed out, and you're going to just do that thing. Um, Oftentimes the one will be a recipient of the other. So you'll have a horse
Yes.
and you'll have this other horse, and this horse is probably a little bit more stressed than this one is, and it'll start to do things
Yeah.
almost using that horse as a grounding tool,
Yeah.
and a comfort. But they've already created that relationship over
Relationship.
time, like,
Yeah.
and that, so it's not like this horse is new and they've just met and this one just does this. Like, that doesn't happen in the
Mm.
natural spaces. They
Yeah.
have developed this friendship over time, and that's their safety person, that's their safety friend.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen automatically, it doesn't happen fast. It is curated and developed with a sequence of very long-term events that happen, so that they are that safety person for
Yeah.
that. and
Yeah.
and that takes time, and yet we have these opportunities where people, or the general public, often thinks of, because I have these conversations a lot with people, like, oh, can I come out and pet your horses? Like, let's talk about that. All
Yeah.
right. And it's this automatic thought of, oh, I'm going to come in, I'm going to touch your horses, because the public has this idea of the role that horses
Yeah.
play in our worlds.
Yeah.
So just shifting that conversation over and saying, well, you know what, the horses, they live in this paddock because that's where they live right now. And we can go and watch them, we can see if they want to come up and sniff you.
Yeah.
um but let's not touch them. But I can tell you that this particular horse, if he does want scratches, he will do X, usually with people.
Mhm.
um that would be my donkey, and he does very specific ways of addressing his needs for physical contact.
Yeah.
But it's and it's that conversation of, we're stepping into their world, let them
Mhm.
invite us, let them, it's the same as if you just met somebody and you're just getting to know them. You're not, there's a process involved.
Yeah.
And it's the same, but it's, for me, talking to people about that, there's that conflict of people's expectations of immediacy, and
Mhm.
what they want versus how this really needs to play out.
Yeah.
And again, I work with good therapists who help navigate the human side of that better than I can.
Yeah.
And then I just help with the relational dynamics of what goes on between horses and people in terms of assessing
Mhm.
and managing the speed of time, and what that means, based on aligning all of these mutual goals that may or may not take place. And in some cases, the horses stay far away.
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah.
that's okay too. And it's having
Yeah.
that conversation with whoever is involved, of that has a that plays a big part in all of this too, is that observation, that distance, that
Mm.
allowing for space and time,
Yeah.
um, and giving ourselves that space and time too.
Yeah. It's how do we start to shift that conversation? And it's well, it's exactly what we're doing here. I mean, these are the ways that we start to shift this conversation. I was like, oh man, I need to talk with Emily again because there's so much great stuff. And like it starts with this kind of thing. I'll tell my students a lot, like, how are you talking about this on your websites? Like it starts even in your intakes. I mean, because I've got in the Equisoma program, we have people who are in the EAS world, right? Who are doing that. We've got horse trainers, we've got equine behavior consultants, we've got animal equine body workers. It's not just EAS, but it's like, how are we looking at ethology, equine trauma, human trauma, how these things intersect, and how do we start working with it, whether the human is the client, the equine is the client, or both together, and you're working with them as like a dyadic client. And how are we working with that? And this idea of like, how do you start to back it up even before people show up at your property? People want to come and visit your property and visit the horses. Okay, like you own a rescue, or hey, you have this program. Okay, how are we setting it up way in advance? So the expectation starts to get shaped in advance. And it's not just about the no's. It's not just about, well, we're not going to do this and we're not going to do that, but we are going to do this and we are going to do that. Like, how do we speak about it in terms of what will be facilitated? Is more curiosity, more opportunity for authentic relationship, more opportunity to have a reciprocal engagement with animals that feels reciprocal and, and isn't so much about, one versus the other, but how can we all have a voice in this? How are we speaking about this, if depending on what your context is? And it starts to shift the conversation a little bit. And it takes these kinds of conversations to do that, and people's intentionality. I wanted to back up before we get too far ahead. And I'm thinking about the ethology stuff again and the affiliative behavior you talked about in the wild and how that affects maybe equine experiences of the quadrants of behaviorism, knowing that there's so much more than just that, of course, going on. Learning theory is but one of multiple things, and there's so much more. But one thing I get curious about is negative reinforcement is used in wild horse bands to teach collision avoidance around boundary space. And Lucy Reese talks a little bit about that, where the mares will teach the youngsters about space management and that kind of stuff, so that when they run as a herd, they've got coherence socially. They've got this ability to all run like starlings that are kind of in murmuration. They don't bash into each other when they're getting away from some predator bird. They are
Mhm.
able to all do this. And I've often wondered about, there's going to be the camps. I call them the camps, the purely positive folks and those who are more natural horsemanship based, and the slings and arrows get thrown at each other all the time. And I go, and there's more than just that. And there's so much nuance here. And I've often wondered about, because the research is tricky, right? The research will talk about how, in some cases, positive reinforcement is the better way to go or the quicker way to get there that's less risky in terms of creating fear response, et cetera. And for things like trailer loading, definitely often an easier way to go about it. And then there's other research that shows some horses respond better to negative reinforcement, and there's all these things, and temperament and history and all these things play part, and it's complex. Um, and I remember I was hearing you say a while ago about it's about the something aversive and then the removal of something aversive. And I go, not all pressure is aversive. Like I can experience pressure and it feels motivating, and or playful or enjoyable or like the bringing up of energy. And I'm reminded a little bit of this idea that all stress is bad, like all gas pedal is bad and all brakes are good. And I go, and that's also very much non-specific and almost not nuanced enough, because like I think about the horses that have their family bands where they've got affiliative behavior. There's no imprint training and forced early abrupt weaning, and they pick their families and they grow their relationships over time. And it's predominantly affiliative. Is it Lucy Reese who talks about like how watching sort of horses in the wild can be really boring because it's like by comparison to what people expect, because it's
Uh,
so less dramatic than what people would see in captive horse behavior, where we see more of the stacking, right, playing out. And those horses have a baseline to come back to, so that if there is some gas pedal, it's experienced in safety and it comes back down to safety. And so
mhm,
whatever aversive or use of pressure is experienced within the herd to make a point or to teach a boundary or whatever, it comes back down to safety and attunement. They have that as their baseline to start with, right? And so many horses in captivity, that's not their experience, right? They're coming in with all this developmental trauma and all this stuff around imprint training and forced early weanings and all this other stuff and handling and training methods and misattunements and owners who are not paying attention and like these things. And so like something like negative reinforcement could potentially be experienced as an aversive or misused as an aversive. Apply an aversive, remove an aversive. That's certainly a
mhm,
variant of negative reinforcement, is with aversives. And I could imagine that there are times where it would be experienced like that because of all these difficulties in captivity, the captivity conditions, the relational conditions in captivity, the environmental conditions, all the stacking. There isn't that felt sense necessarily of safety, of nervous system state being, oh, like affiliative, and that's the baseline, and I go, wow, I wonder how all of this would be experienced differently if horses in captivity had a better deal. Like if we were attending to this more. I'm not saying suddenly everyone should be doing negative reinforcement and, purely positive is the way to go either. I think there's going to be nuance here, but I think all of that stuff gets experienced differently when we hold a different frame, right? Like how would even, because positive reinforcement has its challenges too. Like there's times and places where that gets misused. And so if all of that is sort of secondary to let's look at horses as horses and get to know why they struggle in captivity and why, oh, they're flight animals who have a lot of conflict behaviors and that's just them being naughty. And, and it's like, oh, I wonder if we shifted that, you know, what plays out differently? And then how is the rest experienced as a result of that being different, And I get really curious about those questions. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Emily, but I wanted to jump on that before we lost that one in the conversation.
Well, I think that it's, bringing in that concept of let's look at them as social creatures first.
Yeah,
And realizing that is who they are at their core when we study them out in the wild. Like they are so all of their interactions.
yeah,
When they're grazing, when they're not, they're together. And granted, sometimes the stallion runs off and plays with the boys and then comes back. Sometimes one will split off occasionally and come back, but they come back to their people. They come back
yeah,
to their family. And it's the interactions that take place there. It's
yeah,
nuanced, it's slow, it's constant. Um, and like you said, they're starting from that.
yeah,
That's it. And then again, in our domestic world, yeah, we wean them early, we isolate them, we trade them and sell them as individuals. They don't have any, most of the time stable social structure.
yeah,
So then we're interacting with this other variation of a horse. But if
yeah,
we try and gear things back to who they are, and I don't mean, yes, it would be lovely if all horses could live in big pastures with, horses that they could choose and whatever.
yeah,
But part of what I would like to look at is how we can fill that void.
right,
How we, as a constant in their life, like we might move our horse with us when we move to a different state. We might move our horses to a different stable. Um,
right,
Looking at the constant social engagements in their life, it might be somebody who works at the barn. It might be a trainer who has that horse as part of the lesson program. What can we do to feel a better social environment? And
yeah,
getting back to your point about the collision avoidance and things, um, and part of that, like just that checks and balances within relationships and that communication of whatever. And
mm,
yes, negative reinforcement doesn't have to be painful. It doesn't have to
yeah,
be like
yeah,
scary. It's usually just like some kind of pressure,
yeah,
whether
yeah,
it can be subtle, it can be big, it
yeah,
can be whatever. But and again, on the positive reinforcement side, it can be overwhelming in terms of a stimulus. It can be,
totally.
too much. Um,
Yeah,
and whatever it is, we have to look at the structure. Um, the big difference that I like to look at between that operant conditioning behavioral lens and what we've been talking about is that
yeah,
that operant conditioning lens, from a research perspective, really started to solidify with B.F. Skinner. And that was with pigeons in
yeah,
boxes. Like there was no
yeah.
relational component there. It was pigeons
Lever,
in
lever,
boxes.
pellet,
Yeah.
lever,
Like
pellet. Yeah,
it was,
yeah,
what are you getting from the environment? Not from
yes,
another person, but an environment. Like that's an
yeah,
environment consequence. You put in another person, well, then or another individual, you're adding a social dynamic there. And it's another
yeah,
variable that we have to take into consideration.
yeah,
So not just what can I teach my horse or what behaviors do I want or not want out of my horse, but how can we create a mutual communication? What roles am I playing for my horse
hmm,
outside of training and shaping their behavior? How can
yeah,
we create a mutually beneficial communication strategy here so that both of our needs can be met, even if it is just transactional? Like that's a
yeah,
place to start.
sure,
But letting them ask for things, letting them express their needs, letting them have their boundaries, like all of
yeah,
that as part of
yeah,
the equation, where it's not as much about having an idea of the behaviors we want or don't want as much as it is responding to each other within this dynamic space,
yeah,
but also recognizing those needs as they are for the individual and the species. So that gets back to the ethogram stuff of, oh, he's just being naughty because he doesn't like what I'm doing versus, okay, that's a pretty severe stress behavior. I wonder what's causing that. Like,
Mhm.
and being able to attend to the needs of the individual, even if that means stepping away from them.
Yeah.
And it's not about correcting that behavior. Is that a behavior I want or don't want? But it's that, oh, maybe he doesn't want me here. And that's okay. Like,
Yeah.
I can step away from this.
Yeah.
And it's not always about my boundaries. It's not always about my needs. It's about assessing and
Yeah.
there to maybe that horse doesn't ever want to be ridden. You mentioned a minute ago about
Mm.
those horses. Like, do we know if these are coping strategies? Are they affiliative behaviors? Are they, what are
Right.
these? I have one horse who, oh my God, he was an amazing dressage horse. He was great. He was just sensitive. And it was, I changed his name at one point because I named him after a fine wine because it was like riding Christmas. It was like this
Right.
amazing space. But it dawned on me that all of those behaviors that he was giving me were, he was just being compliant. He was doing
Right.
whatever it took to make this end sooner. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, everything from the cocking of the leg, licking of the lips, bowing of the head, his body was so tense, sometimes almost to the point of shaking. Um, but he would go through these things just to make it end sooner. You put him in a round pen, he immediately comes to the center. Like,
Yeah.
like we'll end this
Yeah.
now. Um,
Yeah.
and this is years ago. I still have him. He's older now. And and again, shifting that discussion, shifting that conversation so that he could tell me what he wanted to do.
Mhm.
Um, that's been far more interesting and far more beautiful in terms of, recognize, oh, okay, here's this horse who was this, you know, really high stressed out dressage horse, very talented. You could take him out on the trail because he was just so stressed all the time. Now he wants to go for hikes and like go for these little, we call them snifaris, like
Yeah.
let's go
Yeah.
explore the woods for a while and come back. And he's great. Like,
Yeah.
he was the dangerous horse. And now because he got to choose and he got to have a say in this,
Right.
it gives us a safer horse. It gives us a more engaged horse. It gives us a horse who wants to be around people rather than avoiding people based on
Yeah.
us having this ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and he got to have a role, he got to have a say in his role in the human space.
Yeah.
Um, and that made a huge difference in terms
Yeah.
of, if we're looking at it again from a behavioral perspective, the expressions of the different kinds of behaviors that he has now versus when he had then are
Mhm.
very different and much better indicators of a higher psychological welfare and well-being than
Yeah.
previously. But
Yeah.
it's about shifting that human angle, that our expectations, our interactions, the type of interactions we have, the whether or not to integrate operant conditioning into this space. And if so, when is it
Yeah.
appropriate versus not? And what are the other
Yeah.
tools that we have in terms of relational dynamics?
Yeah. It reminds me a bit of the research on equines and attachment theory and humans are really interesting for me because there's often this conclusion that dogs and attachment theory that's been looked at for eons, dogs have had a longer trajectory, evolutionarily speaking with humans. And so, dogs can see a human as being an attachment figure to them, sometimes even more than other dogs of their own kind, just because of that long trajectory that we've had together of domestication being such, I think, so much longer. And also they're small and they can be in our homes and, horses can't come into our living rooms in the same way. It's very different. They can't sleep on our beds really. And some of the research I find is fascinating because although there have been studies that demonstrate those four components of attachment between horses and humans, like safe haven, secure base, proximity seeking, and separation distress, that horses can respond to humans with those behaviors. So there's this idea that maybe horses could see humans as an attachment figure. But then there's this other idea of some studies have come to the conclusion, oh, well, horses don't see humans as attachment figures because we did this study and we showed that horses had no response difference between the owner and say a stranger. And I go, okay, but have we looked at the nature of the relationship between the owner? Like there's always this expectation or this assumption that, oh, well, the owner is not just a familiar human. They must have a good relationship because they're owner. And there's this weird assumption that I find is drawn in some conclusions of some studies. And I want to just throw up my hands and go, foul. How was this not caught on peer review? Like maybe have someone who's got attachment theory, in their background review these before we roll it out. Because I look at these and I go, but are they? So a few things I always tell my students. So one is the expectation that horses will turn to humans as an attachment figure, an anthropocentric expectation, right? Horses in the wild, they have massive bodies, they find safety in numbers, and they flee as a herd. I've got a piddly little body. It can't bunch and run off with me. I will do nothing in the wild to help it, save it from a predator. It can't hide in numbers with my little body. Like I'm just not ever going to be perhaps as salient an attachment figure as others of its own kind, full stop. Like I cannot even place that expectation on them. There's also the piece of if we put that aside and go, okay, fine, like horses will likely always be more likely to attach to their own kind than, say, a human. And that doesn't mean that they couldn't have secure enough relationships with humans. And so, what would that look like? And some people might use the word bond here, and that's fine, whatever floats your boat. There is evidence that they do have those behaviors with humans. Okay. Um, and so I think to myself, okay, well, some other studies were like, well, horses can't attach to humans because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, how is the human attending to the equine? How we build attachment security is through the consistency of call and response. If the horse's calls, quote unquote, are not being responded to consistently by the owner, the humans, etc., I'm not going to feel like if I just keep asking for something and you keep misreading me or ignoring me or not listening to what I'm saying, I'm not going to feel connected to you. I'm not going to want to bond and attach to you. And it has nothing to do with how much wither scratches I gave you, or you gave me, right? Or how many carrots you gave me. That's novelty. And that's maybe part of the equine ethogram. But they're also call and responding to each other. Right? So if I, as an equine, am calling and I'm not getting responded to by the humans in my world because they're going about their own business and maybe are checked out about their own needs and are not even, they've learned how to shut that down within themselves. And then I also have a heck of a lot of developmental trauma, imprint training, forced early weaning, isolation, handler to handler, isolated, don't pick my herds. I've got all these relational ruptures. I don't have the foundation within which to have some sort of secure attachment. So how can we possibly have the conversation? Oh, horses can't attach to humans. I think that's the wrong question or the conclusion to be drawn here. I think there's a lot more that needs to be said. So how are we supporting those conditions to be different? Because like you said, we can't all afford to have a 100-acre property with 8 horses, 10 horses that have all chosen each other and found their own band within the band, so to speak. And like we can't all do that. Sometimes it's a track system. Sometimes it's like, where's the enrichment? We're going to do the best we can, right? On these smaller properties. That doesn't mean we all stop having horses. It's just, okay, what can we get that's close enough? And one of them is, like you said, like, how do we get the humans in the animals worlds having more of an attuned relationship where we can heal some of the maybe what we might call loosely insecure attachment between equine and human, if we're going to use that languaging, and support what in the human world we talk about as earned secure attachment. How do you develop it? I hate the word earned. It makes it sound like you have to earn it through performance, but it's not meant to be that way. It's more, how do you develop it? How do you develop
Yeah.
it? And that means us starting to get curious. So when the behavior happens, it's like, oh, we catch a behavior and go fix it. And it's like, well, but what's the whole sequence of things leading up to that behavior? Can we back it up and notice, even within myself, what was happening for me, because that's where all that relational stuff gets repaired, is in all that stuff, you know.
It,
And yeah, it's like, oh, there's so much scope there for animal welfare, equine welfare on a smaller property. Maybe it only has one or two other equine friends. Well, cool. Or one other equine friend. Well, how does the owner or the trainer or the farrier even come in and develop safety and attunement and not feed into fear and misattunement and just, oh, here's another human who I call and there's no response, you know? Like, how do we
exactly.
support that? Yeah, that's where I get excited. I know.
Yes.
Yes.
There's this, like, there's so, again, there's lots of little things that happen when horses are
Yeah.
so as I'm sure everybody has sort of seen at some point this little like nose touch thing, where
Yeah, yeah,
one horse
yeah,
will
yeah.
just will like
Mm,
no stop, or maybe like just a little nip. A lot of times, like if it's a gelding, sometimes they're trying to initiate play. But
sure,
again, if they're on the kind of relaxed or even just a little bit of heightened stress, again, stress being a neutral term, this isn't good or bad,
sure. Yeah,
but
yeah.
like just a little nose touch. And what's interesting to see is when and how that plays out with people. Um,
Uh-huh. Yeah,
and and looking at the human responses, because we're starting to see this a lot more if, again, the horse is in a place, things are maybe a little bit uncertain or uncomfortable.
yeah,
For better or worse, it could be exploratory novelty conditions. It could be, again, therapeutic riding, or maybe they're out being walked on the trail for the first time. Depending on who it is as a human, that
mm,
nose touch comes into play more often. And
yeah,
it's that, okay, how is that human responding to that? So if you have somebody who's in that kind of traditional mindset, a lot of times they'll just sort of stop the horse from doing something or whatever, or
yeah,
ignore it more
yeah,
frequently. But then there's the part where you have people who recognize that this is a thing, and then they'll stop for a minute and just see if their
yeah,
horse needs something else, and it
yeah.
it builds up this greater space of give and take where there's a communication factor in here. Have
Hmm.
Here is a horse who is initiating an interaction that is
Yeah,
a subtle affiliative interaction that is oftentimes reciprocated in some way. It doesn't have to be a touch again. Like that's not usually what
yeah,
happens. It's not usually like this horse touches this horse and this touches again. It's just responded to. It's acknowledged.
yeah,
It's okay. You
yeah.
want to stop? You want to step? You want to sniff each other? Okay. But like they figured out as a means of growing this space. Again, this
Mm,
isn't a new person with a new horse. This is a
no.
person who has created a space in which there is a mutual communication that has built over time,
Hmm.
where it's almost, and again, I'm anthropomorphizing here. It's almost like the horse is like, hey, I just want to, touch base with you for a second.
Hmm.
And it's acknowledged.
Hmm.
And it's okay, if you need to stop, we'll stop. If you want to keep going, we'll go. If we're going to just, you know,
Yeah,
hang out and sniff each other for a second, that's okay too. Um,
yeah,
and it's that space where there's this listening and receiving and listening and receiving. And if you look at, again, the parallels with human relationships,
yeah.
yeah, like
It's the same
that's
thing. Yeah. Was
the
it,
same
is it,
thing.
I think is it Gottman who talks about bids for connection, right? And it's
Yeah.
like, here's this little bid, here's this little bid.
Yep.
And then what precedes the bid? And if it's mouthy behavior, I go, okay, well, is that an animal that can allogroom? If not, and if it's a horse that's in isolation and is very mouthy, well, it's probably not getting its oral and social needs met. Okay, how do we support that? You
Yeah.
know, is it that? That's often what it often is in captivity. Is it like some other thing, an initiation for play? Is it an initiation for connection? Is it some sort of something else? Is it an indicator of pain? Is it an indicator of like, like what is it? And I'll never forget. There was one situation where there was an owner who had a horse, and this horse was always mouthing and grabbing her clothes. And she's like, oh, I don't know how to get this horse to stop. He keeps grabbing my jacket at random times and whatever. And I'm like, I'm not so trusting that it's random. Let's see if we can figure out if there's a pattern or a sequence to this. And of course, right before the horse would grab the jacket, she would have anxiety and she would dissociate a little bit, right? And it was just like, okay, so here's this bid, like I'm picking up on something in you, and like, oh, and so there's this very relational quality to this behavior. If we just look at it as oh, here's a problem I need to fix, and we don't look at the whole sequence, and again, also what's happening for me as human in this equation, it could actually be reflective of something going on for me, and or it could be something going on for them. And it's like, oh, so where in the sequence did this behavior show up? You know,
Yeah.
Hi, Troners, come over here, sweetie. Is it on the way up or is it on the way down? Right. And
Yeah.
is it like a behavior that is sort of showing up during activation increasing, or is it showing up when activation is decreasing? Is it, where is it, and it fills us in so much more. But we kind of need to have that perspective on it, you know?
Well, and that
Yeah.
kind of ties back into part of our conversation earlier of
Yeah. Yeah.
the horse is not a magical unicorn. They have their own stuff. Like they can express their own
Totally.
needs and have their own part of the conversation. So it's sort
Yeah.
of like, all right, it's not just about the horse is reflecting what the human is doing. The horse can bring its own things and its own meaning and ways of being into this space.
Yeah.
But and then kind of tying that into the operant conditioning. This isn't about whether or not we want this behavior or don't want this
Yeah.
behavior. This isn't about shaping a behavior. It's about having a conversation
Yeah.
and and you know figuring out what that means for us in our horse. And like any other relationship,
Mm.
there's ups and downs. There's,
Yeah.
bids for connections, there's rupture and repair, there's all
Yeah.
of these other parts and components to it.
Yeah.
A lot of time we don't even have to like force that into it. It's gonna happen regardless.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
making that just part of that space. But we have to recognize that, okay, this is what this horse does. And this is how this horse, we have to get to know our horses. We have to get to know what that component, those components look like for them, and start to recognize when that does or doesn't, take a role in this space. Because
Yeah.
obviously there's plenty of horses who the minute they have a halter on, they will just shut down.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
and so creating an opportunities for us to explore that communication space first before we start piecing it apart. But yes, what is this coming from this horse? What does that mean? There was a
Yeah.
lovely horse that was up here as part of the herd my horses are with, and he has since moved, but he had this thing where he would go up and he would just nip people. It wasn't a bite. It wasn't like
Yeah.
he would just grab people. And it became apparent pretty quick that it wasn't about anything else other than he didn't play with anybody. He
Yeah.
always wanted to play with people. Like you give him an
Yeah.
object and he
Yeah.
will play all day with a human. And
Hmm.
it was his way of initiating play with people.
Yeah.
Whereas,
Yeah.
but a lot of people took that in a way it was like, oh, he's biting me, he's biting me. But it's sort of like
Mhm.
actually what he's looking for is an interaction. And he's
Yeah.
doing it in a way that actually is very nice in terms of how horses could do this.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
like, so you pick up a ball and you can play with a ball with him. You give him the ball to play with himself. He doesn't want to do that. But
Yeah. It's the
if you're in it,
interaction.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but being able to have the patience and the desire to want to pick that apart and look at it and see what's going on.
Mm.
But it gets back to that. Okay, we also have to have the understanding of who horses are and who, like, what is it? Horses as individuals, it's a very different kind of interaction with a horse than a dog. Dogs have eye contact. Dogs have this whole other space that parallels and overlaps with ours very easily. Like we have literally
Yeah.
bred that into them as like we want them to
Yeah.
have social behaviors that match ours, so we can kind of keep them in our families and interact with them in the ways that meet our needs and meet theirs. And it's this beautiful space. And we didn't do that with horses. Horses come with their own
Yeah.
thing. Very little of which actually overlaps with how humans naturally
Mhm.
typically social bond, and but in a way that's better because we have to navigate that and build it. And
Well, although it's interesting you say that because I think about the ethology that applies to humans and how were we originally as cultures and as communities, and we were a lot more communal and herd-like before. And so, I mean, there's going to be humans in captivity as a captive species, post-colonialism kind of idea, westernization, and how individualized that has become and how much mental health and addictions problems there are rampant now, and how much of this reflects the very fact that we are also not connected to our true nature and our true conditions. Like, there's also that whole commentary as well,
oh
and
my
it's like,
gosh, yeah,
actually, if we look back far enough, I mean, what the horses need and what we need is probably very, very similar, weirdly enough, although they're not
yeah.
primates and we clearly have differences in terms of our species and our needs and our sensory systems are quite different. There's also the fact that we're mammals of a communal mammal species, a social species, and the conditions are not supporting those needs to be met. And we see humans struggle and we see equines struggle for similar reasons, weirdly enough, oddly, and I'm laughing a little bit here because I'm mindful of my dog. We were just talking about dogs. So my dog's come over a couple of times now and she's whining a little bit, trying to get my attention. It's not a bathroom thing. The neighbors' kids are in the yard and they're playing outside and they're running around shrieking. You probably can't hear it because I've got the audio set so that it minimizes outside noises. But they're outside having a grand time in the yard. And of course, she's seeing them and is whining and getting sort of her energy up along with them. And so she's having a response to the busyness in the yard over there. And so, and it's interesting because she's of an interesting species. She's a rescue. We had her DNA done over the summer. It was really interesting. We had always guessed she was about 75% border collie. I was close, 67% border collie. She's mostly border collie. I was super close on my guess. And the rest of her is like 9% German Shepherd, which we had wondered, about 3 or 4% Kelpie, And 21% Saluki, which is actually not a misnomer or a misguess in the math. There's a Saluki breeder about 3 hours from here, and they're not very common, and it's entirely possible that is completely plausible. Like I was like, oh, that is actually a possibility that she could very well have 21%. But her sensory system, she would be classified as a reactive dog. Like it doesn't take much to stack her, and she gets stacked real easy. And she's got it coming from all directions. She's got the border collie herding instinct. She's got the German Shepherd, guarding instinct. Plus, she's a sight hound. So she's got it like she doesn't shut off easily. And this is through her genetics, unfortunately. There's things we can do to support her, of course, but I'm just mindful of that too. It's like, oh, we've created dogs too to fit our worlds. And yet, the breeding that we've created for dogs, just like the breeding we've created for horses, comes with these interesting side effects, so to speak. We breed for trait. And as a result of that, we wind up with nervous system states that support those traits. And then we have these challenges and we call them behavioral, So I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing she probably really would love to go outside. She's staring, staring out the window at the kids in the yard and would probably love to go. And as much as I don't want to leave our conversation, I'm really mindful of this whole animal conversation and listening to the sequence and realizing, okay, her coming over to find me is at the peak of that curve. And I'm going, okay, sweetheart, I'm going to wrap this
Yeah.
up. But this has been lovely, Emily. Thank you. Last time we chatted, I was like, man, we could probably talk for hours.
Yeah, we
So
could. We
yeah,
could.
yeah,
So thank you very much for the
yeah.
lovely conversation.
Yeah, lovely. And we'd love to have you back again at some point, but feel free to reach out and I'll reach out. And in the meantime, we'll get this video up there. And if people want to learn more about you and your work, we'll put your website there and any social media links that you have to offer, we'll put those up as well for people to go and find you and learn more about the wonderful stuff you're doing. So
Great. Thank you.
thanks, Emily. Wonderful. And we'll see you soon.
All right.